Good afternoon, Mr. Brito, and thank you for the opportunity to present with you. As an avid beer enthusiast, I was very excited when you approached me at my firm to present to you. I know you're a busy man, so I'll dive right into my presentation. First, you asked me to prepare a summary of breweries by state. I decided it would be best to present a heat map for this data. We can see clearly that Colorado has the most breweries, represented by the dark red color here. It appears to be about 50, followed closely by California, Michigan, Texas, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Washington State. We can see that North and South Dakota, Nevada, West Virginia, Arkansas tend to have lower breweries, as represented by the beige color. Next, before I dive into the rest of the presentation, I should address what I did with the values that were missing or not applicable in the data set. So there were about 60 variables for the ABV variable missing. So given that this did not represent a high volume of the overall data points, I imputed a mean value for these. Since there was a larger proportion of IBU variables missing, I decided to present the rest of the presentation both having removed those not applicable values as well as having imputed a mean IBU by style for those values. So you asked about the distribution of the median ABV by state. So we can see here that the majority of states lie somewhere between 5% and 6% for the median ABV, potentially indicating consumer preferences for an alcohol by volume. This is confirmed later on in the presentation, and I'll get there in a moment. You also asked about the median distribution of IBU values. So we see that there's a higher variance in this data by state than was present with ABV, but I think what's important here is that the majority of IBUs by state fall somewhere between 25 and 40 international bitterness units. This relationship doesn't really change whether we have that not applicable values removed or if we've imputed a mean, as illustrated by this next chart here. The distribution does change, but we can still see that the majority of values fall between 25 and 40. You also asked about the maximum ABV and IBU beers overall, and so I found that the maximum IBU beer was the Bitter Bitch Imperial IPA with an IBU of 138, and this beer is brewed by the Astoria Brewing Company in Astoria, Oregon. The maximum alcohol by volume beer had an ABV content of 12.8%, and this was the Lee Hill Series Volume 5 Belgian-style quadruple ale brewed by Upslope Brewing Company in Boulder, Colorado. Next, you asked about the distribution of the ABV variable, and so I took a look at this variable overall first before breaking it down by state. The thing that I found most interesting about the distribution was that 50% of the values fell between the first quartile and the third quartile. So 50% of the alcohol by volume of beers fell between 5% and 6.7% ABV. So showing a very high concentration, again, as I mentioned previously, in that range. Very indicative of consumer preferences of a lighter alcohol by volume beer. Breaking out by state reinforces this discovery. We can see that there's a higher distribution our distribution of states really kind of reflects our findings from the previous slide. But I think what's important to note here is that no matter what state the brewery is located in, the median and the mean ABV beers tend to be about 5.5% to 6.25%. So again, a very tight cluster. This is further illustrated by a scatter plot. You did ask me to investigate the relationship between alcohol by volume and international bitterness units. So I plotted a scatter plot, and touching on my last point, we see a high concentration of values both with NA values removed and on my next slide with mean values imputed. There's a high concentration of beers with about 5% to 6% ABV and about 25 IBU. So again, this seems to indicate that consumers really prefer beer in this range. As for the relationship, we can clearly see that there's a positive correlation between ABV and IBU, meaning that as alcohol by volume increases, international bitterness units tend to increase as well. One thing I found very interesting about this chart was looking at the higher alcohol by volume beers, there's a higher distribution of international bitterness units in this. To me, this seems to indicate that the market hasn't quite figured out exactly what the consumer wants, and this presents an opportunity for Budweiser to step in and do some research and development to produce a beer that might fit consumer preferences in that space. Next, you asked me to present on K&N relationships in ABV and IBU. So this was best illustrated to me by a scatter plot. We can clearly see that IPAs, represented by blue dots, tend to have a higher ABV and IBU than ales do, represented by red dots. Using K&N machine learning classification, we're actually able to predict with about 85% accuracy which if a beer is an IPA or an ale, given that we know it is either one or the other based on the ABV and the IBU of that beer. Last, you asked me to present any other interesting findings I had from the data. So I took a look at the beer sizes by state, which revealed to me that 16-ounce cans are really only produced in 5 states, being Michigan, Indiana, California, Colorado, and Oregon. Looking at those states geographically, those are on the West Coast and the Midwest. So perhaps there's an opportunity for Budweiser to step in on the East Coast and the South to fill a gap, fill a void where maybe consumers would prefer having more options in a 16-ounce beer. So this leaves me with three main takeaways. One, it seems there's consumer preference for beers between 5 and 6.25% alcohol by volume and around 25 international bitterness units. Two, there's an opportunity for Budweiser to explore consumer preferences on higher alcohol by volume beers. And three, there may be an opportunity for Budweiser to create brand loyalty by creating a local presence on the East Coast or southern United States and distributing higher volume cans. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to working with you again.